I do not see any hands raising. Linda, would you want to take a 10-minute break before my presentation, or should we just go straight in and maybe get done a little early?
I know how I would vote, but I will take a Democratic for everybody else. I just say let's just go on through, but we will see. Is that okay with everybody if we just go on right into Eric's?
Go on.
Yeah, that's fine.
Agree.
Thank you for offering. Yeah.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you,
and my
Stephanie.
contact information is in the chat. So if you
Stephanie, yeah.
feel free to reach out to me for whatever reason.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So Linda, I'm not, the title confused me a little bit because I wasn't sure if it was something different than what I was planning on talking about, but I'm more than happy to range my conversation into a variety of different things. But let me start off with a little bit of a discussion of who I am. I loved seeing Eric's name because that sort of plays a little bit into my life. I have I have a family, and I have a work sort of relationship to disability. The family is on my mom's side, her mother, so my grandmother, her sister, so my aunt, and 4 of my 5 cousins are deaf. And they live in California, and I used to go out there in my summers and spend time with them. And probably one of my earliest memories of interacting with them is, even though my aunt is 40-ish, 50 years older than me, when we went to restaurants, and this would have been in the 1970s, the waiters and everybody would look at me to answer their questions rather than treating her and my older cousins, because 4 of my 5 are older cousins, as individuals. I would be the one that the staff would deal with. So that was one of sort of my first memories. But what I wanted to mention about Eric's name is my name was originally supposed to be Erich, and my grandmother looked at it and said Erich, and my mom put her finger over the H and she said Eric. I said okay. So that's how I ended up with not having the H. So I was very happy to see Eric's spelling, because I like other spellings, and sometimes in my life sort of wish I would have had that spelling. On a professional side, before joining the National Disability Rights Network, I was with then Representative and then Senator Jim Jeffords from the state of Vermont. Sort of followed my mom into work one day in 1980 when I was 11 years old, and sort of stayed there. Not the normal situation of how you get sucked into a political job. And spent my summers and my winter breaks doing things for Representative and Senator Jeffords, worked part-time while I was in law school, and then joined his staff full-time after law school until he retired in 2007. One of the first bills that then Representative Jeffords worked on in 1975 is what was called it was the precursor for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, but it was called the Education for the Handicapped Act. And that was one of the first bills he worked on when he got to the House of Representatives. He was also one of the few members of Congress that had a staff member focused solely on disability related issues. And that was one of the topic areas they covered. So no matter where disability popped up, that was that staffer's issue area to deal with. When he went over to the Senate in 1988, he took a leadership role in what's called the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, focused a lot on education issues, labor issues, and especially how those impact people with disabilities. So my work environment was very focused on sort of disability work, and I sort of imbued me. Yeah, that's not the word I'm looking for. I can't think of the word right now. sort of infused me in a lot of my thinking. And so that's sort of my work, my professional pre-NDRN. And then in January of 1993, I'll get to the personal part. It's really two parts. President Clinton's first inauguration day, I had a stroke. The easiest way to describe it is a stroke. There's a bleed in my head, right occipital lobe. I spent about a month and a half in intensive care, and then about 2.5 months at a rehab hospital here in DC. It was my last semester of law school. So needless to say, I didn't finish the law school right then, but I was able to get out after all those amazing doctors and amazing therapists, and be able to slowly return back to some things. I took a lot of time off, but then over the course of another year, finished off the last semester of law school, and was able to get back to working sort of part-time, and then, as I said, full-time after. That's where I sort of came upon the Americans with Disabilities Act, to get accommodations at school, and also to take a bar exam, and thankfully be able to pass it. I still have some lingering aspects. I do not see anything nose left. My left side is very noticeably weaker than my right side. And as what may pop up during my conversation today, there are times words sort of escape me. And so I have a concept in my head, but I can't think of the exact word. And so that put me into the disability community. I have a son and a daughter. Both have 504 plans. My son, for a little while, did have an IEP, but we were finding that not to be the best thing for him. The Section 504 plan was better. And the story I'll sort of say on the personal side for that is they're almost 5 years apart, my daughter being older, but they both went to the same middle school. And one of the interesting things that we noticed immediately is one of the first things they do when you started 6th grade in middle school is they put up this giant chart. And when you go into the math section of, okay, this is the order you take the classes, this is how you can get to calculus in high school and graduate having taken calculus. So we saw that with my daughter. We were like, okay, that's fine, that's great. About 5 years later, we go to the same school, same presentation, and up pops the little map, and we looked at it, and we noticed that it didn't end with calculus. It ended with a math class earlier, and we raised that question. And it was just, the consideration was they had no concept that a student with a disability could get to and complete calculus. So they never bothered to make the map that way. And so that was one of my first sort of experiences with my children on that kind of aspect. So it is, it's, as I said, and then after Senator Jeffords retired, I looked around for jobs, and a position really attracted my interest at the National Disability Rights Network. And I have been there ever since, just starting my 16th year. And as I now said earlier, the head of public policy there, blessed to have 4 staff beneath me that work on all these variety of issues, and doubly blessed to have entities like ADAP that are doing such good work, which makes our ability to sort of sell their points and sell the whole network and sell disability rights in a much easier way. Now, one of the things I wanted to sort of talk about tonight was sort of the message box, and sort of walk through the messaging. I did not download to my home computer that I'm on right now my slide decks. Is that something you could bring up, Linda?
I can. Which one did you want me to do?
The message box one?
Okay, yeah, just give me a minute and I'll pull it up.
Okay. Well, so I will not take credit for this theory, and I talk about it, but I never sort of wrote it down. This comes from one of our executive directors in Kansas that sort of crafted this message box principle. And what we're trying to do here is, and we'll talk about it a lot more tomorrow, is messaging is a huge part of all advocacy work. And the thing you have to remember as a former Hill staffer is public policy writing is very different than pretty much any kind of writing. Legal writing, you want to write briefs that are hundreds of pages with cites and all sorts of stuff and very dense and very thick. You know, when you're writing to write a novel, you want to write an intriguing story, you want to have really in-depth characters, you want to do those kinds of things. Honestly, for public policy writing, you got to get to the point, you got to make the point, and it's got to be pretty short and sweet. Hill staffers are not going to sit down and read something that's 5 pages single spaced. It's just, there's just not enough time and not in their life, and not enough, honestly, I'm not going to say brain power in a bad way, but they're thinking about so many different things that it's really, really difficult for them to focus. And what you will find, especially with senators, is that you vote on everything. You're voting on everything from employment to transportation to housing, especially to international relations, international affairs, defense budget, you name it. But they will really sort of self-select and focus on some particular issues. And so getting to know what your members' interests are and where their excitement lies can be very helpful. It may not always be in the topics you care about, but if they are in the topics you care about, then that makes them more knowledgeable and understanding of the issues. But if it's not an area that they're focused on, then you have to think about how you're going to message it. And you got to think about being really concise, really short, really sweet, getting to the point, giving them the arguments so that they know it. They just don't have the breadth and the ability to think about things in depth and for a long time. So you really got to get to those messages and be very concise and very clear. Again, if it's someone that works on these topics and knows it, then you'll find that you can spend a little bit more time, you can give them a little bit more, they're going to want more information. But otherwise, you're going to have to be sort of short and sweet. And I will convey this story. When I was on the Hill, I wrote many a constituent response letter. Senator Jeffords took constituent responses very seriously. And we probably did it a little more in depth than a lot of other offices. And I'll be honest there. But at the same time, I had a standard way of answering letters. And I've thought about this the other night, and I could pretty much do it again in my head. It was like, thank you for contacting our office on this. You put the bill number, you put the broad topic, whatever. We appreciate the time and effort you took to convey your message. Paragraph sort of laying out the history of the bill, the basics of the bill, or the basics of the information. If we had a position, lay that out in the next paragraph. If we didn't, sort of talk about a little bit sort of the broad topic itself. And if this bill or this issue should come before the Senate or the House, we'll be sure to keep your thoughts in mind. Again, thank you very much for contacting /emailing /phone call, whatever, my office. Please continue to be in touch. I had that standard letter, and I could pretty much write that letter in my sleep. Just had to sort of put in the various topics. And again, because members cover so much, they may not be able to and consistently really show the depth of knowledge in the responses you're going to get from them. So I don't put too much weight into the responses you get, but know that they've had to register in their head that they've gotten a contact on this particular thing. Feel free to contact more than once. You can definitely do that. But what I would strongly suggest, and we can talk about this a little bit more tomorrow in sort of the depth, in more detail, is getting those kinds of in-person meetings. Now, it doesn't necessarily, and this is coming from a staff member side, doesn't need to be the representative or the senator themselves. There, you may not want to hear this, but staff do have a lot of power on the Hill. You know, the member is the one that ultimately makes the decision on how they're voting. And there's only so much that a staff can do to potentially either flip a member's vote or change a member's vote. But the information that the member's getting a lot of times coming through the staff. So spend your time, spend your energy getting to know the staff, being a good source of information for them, conveying your thoughts and your questions to them. So, you know, send in those thoughts, but when you get a response from a member's office, it will normally have a set of initials on it on who wrote it. And then it's a question of tracking down. And I'll say this, if you guys get these responses with these kinds of initials, feel free to email me and we can dig around a little bit, but try to track down who actually wrote it. And most staff, be it in the House or the Senate, will make trips back to the home state a couple times a year. So there might be an opportunity to set up a face-to-face meeting and just have a discussion with them. And I would say this is critically important in the disability world, to be able to sort of put that face, that individual in front of the staffer to try to overcome any of those preconceived notions they might have about people with disabilities is critically important. One of the bills I worked on for many years in the Senate is called the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. This is not a disability bill, but it was focused on making sure that you couldn't discriminate based on LG. At the first when it was introduced, LGB community, which is the lesbian, gay, and bisexual community. A couple years into the bill being introduced, the transgender community said, hey, why are we not included? We want to be included. And there was a long set of discussions on the Hill. And the decision was then made, yes, we need to be inclusive of all in this. And so the bill then started to focus on LGB, and then we added T at that point. We had a very strong advocate on transgender rights in Vermont and her name was Karen. But in all honesty, Karen's voice was very deep and very bass. And so if you answered the phone, you had no idea this was an individual that used the pronoun she. I recognized her voice. And so I would say she, and I would use the proper pronouns, but a lot of people wouldn't. But one of the conversations we had for a very long time with the transgender community was, look, you need to get in front of the staff. You need to get in front of the members. You need to show them who you are, that it's not their preconceived notions of what an individual that's a transgender person is, and that you need to be able to overcome that. And the way you can do that is being in front of them. It's hard to carry those preconceived notions when the actual person is there. And I think that carries over very strongly to the disability community. And so the more you can get those in-person meetings, the more you can have those discussions, the more you can show those examples of people that have transitioned from subminimum wage to competitive integrated employment, the benefits of IDEA and education, the benefits of transition, all those kinds of things. That's going to break down those preconceived notions. And the last thing I'll say before getting to my messaging box on that is, you may be meeting with someone that has a title like staff assistant or legislative correspondent. Do not be dismayed by the fact that it doesn't sound like the most prestigious title under the sun, because the Hill has a lot of transition. I was a very rare example. A lot of people are in Hill offices and then move to another office, or there's a lot of promotion from within. So someone that may have started out as a front office person, answering phones, going to be a legislative correspondent, and a legislative aide could end up being a legislative director. And so you want to make friends with those people early, or they may go to another office and be a legislative aide or a legislative director. So don't worry that you seem to be meeting with someone that might be considered low on the totem pole in terms of where they are in the hierarchy of the office. They may eventually be in a good place and be very helpful to you. So treat them with respect as you'd want to be treated, and give them the information, show that you're a good source of information. And then when they get into those higher up places where they can really help and influence decisions, you'll have made a good friend. So keep that in mind. James, do you want to do you want me to read it, or I think I can.
I can say a word, Eric.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of follow up on the point that you're making, and I shared that in the chat box. But literally this week, working with Eric and some of the other NDRN staff on some messaging on the Hill, I ran across a name that I knew, but I knew him because must be his grandfather is a former Chief Justice of the state of Alabama, but a staffer in Senator Richard Shelby's office now is a young person named Bo Torbert. And Eric, when I looked at his LinkedIn resume, he had done every starting assignment that you can imagine. But, you know, now he's full-time legislative aide or whatever the title is. And so it just makes the point, you know, he's a young person, but he went up on Capitol Hill, took whatever job they told him to start with. And now, you know, he's on the list that you're having me contact. So I just wanted to provide a real concrete example of your point.
No, that's great. And since Senator Shelby's retiring, what you may end up also finding is that he ends up going to either who replaces Senator Shelby, or he may go to a representative from Alabama. You just never know. And so the staff move around and are fairly fluid, once again, except for me. And so, you know, create those relationships. And then I can't tell you how many P&A executive directors have come to town, met with a legislative correspondent, come back the next year and has been a legislative aide. And it's like, okay, you know, it's just sort of the way it works.
Eric, on the same lines, there was the director of policy at AUCD a couple of years ago. She was a family faculty in Lind, I think, Indiana, and she did her diligence. Who? Ryland Gray. Yeah, Ryland. So she was contacting her legislators, and she had made this friend with hers in her state, and lo and behold, Katie Campbell was then for Alabama. She was working for our senator there, so he's not there anymore, but so yeah, it was like Ryland said, hey, let's go meet Katie. She knows all about everything I've been telling her about for years on the health issues and what AUCD priorities are. So yes, it's fun to watch them move around.
And the other thing I'd say is, in addition to, like, I focus on the federal level, but since you guys are there at the state, cultivate those relationships with the state members, because a lot of times politicians sort of work their way up through the system. They may start in the cities, they may start in the state legislators, then they may go to the federal. That's becoming a little less clear, as not being a politician is becoming a bigger thing. But I think you'll still see a lot of politicians work their way up through city, state, you know, local, city and state, and then to the federal. So if you've made a relationship with them at an earlier stage in their career, they're going to know you, and you don't have to spend a lot of time doing the basic background and explanation at that point. So another thing to keep in mind. So what I wanted to talk to you about, wow, I've already talked for a long time, is a concept called a message box. As I said, this is not I did not create this. This came from one of our executive directors, actually the Kansas executive director. He also served in the state legislature. And I think this is an amazing way to look at crafting your message. So do I have control or do I need to say next slide? Okay, there we go. So the message box tool is, as it says, if you use this simple yet powerful tool before you take action, I promise you, you will have a message that really is clear, concise, contrastive, and we'll talk about that a little bit in just a bit, and convincing. So what you're really trying to do is, as I said earlier on, is to create this really short, sweet message. And the contrastive part of it is you need to be able to stand out and show why you're the right way to go versus what your opponents are saying. Opponents is probably the best word. We'll go there. Next slide. So here's sort of the 4 parts of the message box, and partly why it's called a message box. So in the upper left, you've got what you say about your position, which you're going to be positive about. The other side, then the next one to the right is what they say about your position. And that usually is going to be negative against what you're trying to advocate for, which is why the little negative sign's there. The next one down in the next row is what you say about their position, and you're usually trying to be contrary to their position, so it's a negative. And then the 4th part is what they say about their position, and they're going to want to be positive about their position, so that's why it's positive. So you've got this contrastive between the positives that you're saying, sometimes negatives against their position, and the negatives they're saying about your position, and the positives they're saying about theirs. So you really want to think about these 4 different components of how a message is being made. And ultimately, you want to look at all those. Next slide. So again, and I just sort of led right into this, usually people look at the issue from one side. We talk about the need to phase out sub-minimum wage, and it's phase out sub-minimum wage, and that's all you should do, and that's a focus, and that's what you talk about. But what you really want to do, and what this message box does, is challenges you to look at it from all sides. It makes you have to think about all the different arguments that are being made in support of you, against your side, in support of their side, and against their side, and really look at them all together. And so why is that important? Next slide. It really forces you to write down your points and look at your message from all sides. And what it does is it also then makes sure that you have to look at the weaknesses in your own argument. As this says, it allows you to use mental judo to make your message stronger, take their strengths and weaknesses into account. And that's really a big key. Being able to, and this is why it's important to look at the message from all sides, whether you ultimately get down to the single message, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but when you get down to that single message, being able to sit in a meeting with a staffer or with a member of Congress, and when they come back at you and say, well, what about X? What about the need for people with disabilities not to be kicked out of their sub-minimum wage job? You will have already thought about it in creating this message box, and you can provide that answer right then, because you've had to sort of think about it and figure out how you would answer that kind of question in writing your message. So that's why it's key to be able to do this. I will say this point here, but I'll probably repeat it again tomorrow. If you do get a question from a staffer or a member that you are not definitive on the answer, don't make it up. Don't just throw something out there. What you say to them is, I'm not sure at this point. Let me think about that a little bit and get back to you. It is better to be seen as a person with a good set of information and giving them the correct information than to burn the bridge by giving them bad information. And they don't mind not getting the information right then and there. You can give them an answer later on, and that's fine. Okay, so next slide. Any questions on the basics so far? Doesn't look like it. Okay. Next slide. I'm going to close the participants. So once you have the message box filled out, then you look for the strengths and weaknesses. You want to develop your message or the point you want to convey. Your message is a couple of sentences. It is not a policy paper. You can write a policy paper later on, but again, staff aren't going to read a policy paper, but they're going to listen to you if you're going to talk in a couple sentences or you're writing something in a couple sentences. And so once you have your message or point you want to make, then you can take action. Start with the point and you want to work backwards. Next slide. So this is sort of a message box example around restraint and seclusion. So we as the Protection and Advocacy Agency are very strongly believe, there we go, that's the phrasing I want to go with, that restraint and seclusion should be banned and or extremely limited by a piece of federal legislation. And a lot of our members are working on something similar in all the states and territories to try to get this kind of legislation that would ban seclusion and severely restrict or sometimes ban the use of restraint. And so this is sort of looking at it through that kind of lens. So the message box here, the upper left-hand corner, is sort of what you say about your stand. This kind of legislation is purely, it's about accountability. People need to be held accountable for whether they're abusing students by the overuse of restraint and seclusion. There really is a national consensus on this topic. Most states in this country have some kind of restrictions or bans on the use of restraint or seclusion. You need safety and certainty for students and teachers. Restraint and seclusion is a dangerous tactic. There's tons of studies and research that say that it's a bad thing to do. It leads to bad outcomes, those kinds of things, and ultimately is a fundamental rights issue. So those are sort of all the positive things that you would be saying about the need to pass a restraint and seclusion bill. Then you want to look at and say, okay, what are our opponents saying about our stand? Clearly, one of the big things you're going to say is it's more red tape. You're just adding regulations. You're adding more things for the overburdened teachers. You're adding more bureaucracy. There's definitely costs to this. Where are you going to get that money from to pay for that cost? Really, where's the problem? We're not seeing students dying. We're not seeing grave amounts of students injured. You're placing another burdens on teachers. Their focus should be on the classroom, not on filling out paperwork, those kinds of things. So you want to think about the arguments they're going to make against your proposal, and you put that in that box. And then you go down to the next row, and it's like, what would you say about their stand? When did schools ever ask for greater accountability? Just that argument's not going to fly because no school's ever going to stand up and say we want more accountability. How much money are we really spending on schools? And we're thinking of adding a little bit here. And more recently, you got all of these COVID relief funds. You've got tons of education funds that are flooding in. Now, remember, this is coming from someone in Kansas. So when he wrote it, it's ask people in Mississippi, which I guess you could say about Alabama too, what local control means. Local control normally means loss of civil rights. And standards in schools, if the schools create them, aren't really enforceable. So there's really no change. And so that's what you have to think about. How would you respond to the arguments that they're making? And then in the last box, it's sort of what they're saying about their stand and why they're opposing it. This is all about local control. Let a local elected officials decide the standards. Many schools have already adopted standards and guidelines. We should trust and support the schools. So you want to put these messages into this box so that you can really look at it as a one document and really sort of, as I said earlier, sort of do mental judo about this and think about this and say, okay, where might our weaknesses be? Where might, their strengths be? And how would we counter their strengths? what are our weaknesses and what can we do to sort of address those weaknesses in our argument? What's their strengths on attacking us and what's their weaknesses on attacking us that we might be able to exploit? And, the same on, their stand, what's their strengths? Clearly, if you've got members that are very focused on local control, those kinds of things, that argument's going to work very strongly with them. And you have to think about, okay, well, if I'm talking to this member, how am I going to address, because the first thing probably out of their mouth is going to be, this should be a local control issue. And you need to have a thought on how you would address that. When you're facing someone that may be very supportive of you, you need to think about, okay, what's the strongest ways in that upper left-hand corner to really make that and shore them up as being supportive of your position. Next slide. So what they came up with, and I mean, I'll read it, but this is what, using that message box and all the different parts, what they came up with is this is sort of their phrasing. This seclusion and restraint bill is about keeping both school children and teachers safe. So think about it there. It's not just the children's things. You're addressing one of those arguments in that sentence that you're going to hear, which is our teachers need something to be safe. And you're addressing that here by saying, by having these standards, you are keeping them safe. So you're taking head on one of the arguments that they were going to bring on the other side. Having certain and clear standards protects children, teachers, and schools. Again, pointing out the sort of the strengths of yours, but also, attacking, I wouldn't necessarily call it a weakness, but going after one of the strengths they're going to say. So without standards, proper training and reporting of these dangerous tactics, I'm not reading right. Without standards, proper training and reporting of these dangerous tactics, then the whole system is at risk. It's my left field cut coming in. These are common sense accountability measures based on the growing national consensus on seclusion and restraint. And as it says, this may not be a word for word exactly what you say, but it's the overall point you want people to walk away with after hearing what you say on seclusion and restraint. So you've talked about protecting children. You've talked about protecting teachers. You've talked about it being a clear standard. And then if you don't have these standards, then the whole system's at risk. Short, sweet message, very, very clear, but you've addressed some of your positives. You've addressed what the other side sees as their positives. You sort of hit some of what they might come at in terms of your weaknesses. And you've hit what you may see as some of their weaknesses. So you've sort of taken all those four things and combined it really into a short and sweet statement. I mean, this is one bullet. It might be a little long, but overall, this is not a hard thing to read. And it's also not a hard thing to sort of get in your head and be able to repeat back to staff and members of Congress or state legislators when you see it. Next slide. Any questions on sort of how to use the message box and sort of come up with a concise, hopefully concise message? I think this is what happens when you're the last speaker of the day. It's okay. I don't remember, is that the end of my slides? Evidently, yes.
It is.
So I am more than happy. I mean, so really the point of this is to not have, don't just, and we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, don't just jump into sort of a knee-jerk reaction and thought. It's if you can think about and sort of craft your message in this way where you're really having to think about pros, cons, the negatives, those kinds of things, you'll be able to really come up with a short, sweet, concise point. And you'll find that it really sticks not only with you, but it sticks with the people you talk to. And again, it's going to make you seem like a good information source. You're not really talking in hyperbole. You're not being over the top. It's you're conveying a good message with strong advocacy. I'm not saying don't be intense, but it's going to come to the staff and it's going to come to the members that you really are an information source and you know what you're talking about and you know what you're doing. And that is the key. Hill staff are always looking for people that they can trust for information and can reach out to. Because again, you're covering, much like as you saw with my staff today, that they cover a lot of issues. Hill staff are worse in some respects. You are, when I was up there, I was everything Judiciary Committee related, labor, banking and insurance, housing, election and campaign finance law. That was my portfolio. Did I have a depth of knowledge on any of those particular topics? Probably a little more on the Judiciary Committee stuff because of my law degree, but the other stuff, very thin. But I knew people in Vermont that I could get in touch with and talk to, and people in DC that I trusted and could talk to. And that's really what you want to be seen as by these legislators and their staff, is someone that provides them information, provides them, good stories, good input, and could be a good sounding board for stuff. And then once you've made that connection, they'll come back to you over and over and over again. And that's what you want to do. And that's the importance. So that's sort of my spiel on messaging and trying to be concise and clear on that. I'm happy to talk about any other topics you'd like to talk about for a little bit. I don't need to keep you all the way till 7 o'clock, but happy to answer any questions you might have about my time on the Hill, with my time at NDRN, any policies you guys are working on, brainstorming. I am an open, okay, showing my age, I'm an open blackboard. Actually, that's really my
Hey,
wife
Eric.
teach. Oh, go ahead.
Ms. Spangler, we, the DD network, especially ADAT, helped develop a bill, House Bill 522, the Colby Act, and it's just for supported decision making. The next stop is the Judiciary Committee for the bill. If we were to use this message box that you just described, in my experience, there's not necessarily a lot of opposition toward a sound argument, like the example you used with restraint. Well, that seems to most in my shoes like a no-brainer, but there's a lot more explaining and educating going on with the Colby Act. What would you recommend when it's just bringing people up to a level of awareness? The same exact approach, or just making the assumption that this might be their argument?
I would start with, as much as I hate to make assumptions, I would try to think of the counter side arguments. You're right. That's a much more difficult issue to raise. I think one of the things that'll pop up, but you might be in a good position on this as long as you've got some parents that are advocating for this too, is guardianship is usually seen as a plus or minus situation. It's either all or nothing. And there's a lot of stigma over if someone's got a guardian, they therefore must need a guardian for a particular reason. And then that tends to cloud people's judgment that, if a person needs a guardian for financial reasons, a lot of times they'll jump to, they must need it for everything. And,
Right.
and that could be one argument you might get, which is clearly they're not capable of handling anything. And I think supported decision-making in the process is a very good way of sort of ferreting out things that they might need a little bit more help on and things that they really can make their own decisions. Individuals can make their own decisions. Yeah, I don't think you're going to get the purely negative. I think you have to address some of the stigma and the yeah, this is where my brain's not working, but the interpretations of what a person with a disability that has a guardian may need. So I wouldn't think of it necessarily as a negative argument, but how do we get someone to realize that not everyone needs this level of intensive guardianship, and so therefore this is why this is good. I hope that helps.
Okay. That's what I was thinking. I just wanted to see if you would concur.
Yeah, I mean, there clearly is going to be some cost to it. So that could be an argument some people will make. But, you know, I think that's probably not going to be the biggest argument you're going to see against it. I think what you're probably going to get is more the stigmatizing. There must be a reason they've got a guardian, and if they've got a reason in one area, they've got to carry it over to everything else.
Right. One of the biggest hurdles I've come across is the word capacity. And I guess there's this stigma attached to capacity that it's a one and done. Once you get a number on an IQ score or a functionality test, that's it for life. And it's been proven time and time again through research that these IQ tests are not always valid. They're just snapshots. Capacity is fluid. It's not fixed. And so that's just more of a societal stigma going forward than anything. And it's not necessarily opposition. It's just trying to create the awareness and educate folks on here's what's really going on with guardianship.
And I think this is one of those perfect examples of the get in their face and show them the individual, and that the individual is not as, and I hate using this word, but I'm using air quotes, incapacitated as you may think by the phrase disability.
Right.
You know, here are all these things that my son, my daughter, this individual is very capable of doing. But, you know, and if you give them the proper support system for making decisions, then they can make very good decisions.
Right.
I mean, another thing to think about in a way is to really talk up the, you know, I've said this before, which is most parents will let their children make decisions knowing that they may not always make the best decision. And what you'll find is they will just make that assumption that that's okay to do and the right thing to do. Actually, that's the way to go. The right thing to do for children without disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
But all of a sudden, if it's a children with a child or a young adult with disabilities, we can't let them live and learn.
Can't let them fail. Yeah.
And so, but how will you be able to learn in life if you don't have some failures?
Right.
Having that structure and that system of supported decision making will minimize the bad consequences of a failure. Doesn't mean that you're not going to have a failure, but individuals learn from failing, and everybody should be able to do that. You shouldn't just assume that if you're a person with a disability, we can't let you fail.
Right. Absolutely.
But I think in this situation, probably stigma is the biggest thing, and it's not really a negative argument against your point. It's where they're going to flop people with disabilities.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. I mean, and I love having these conversations about these. I like that. If one learns from falling, then I've learned a lot. And I've fallen many a time. So I love having these conversations, and it's good also to think about, and you can do this in a coalition, or you can just do this with your friends, is have these kinds of discussions on these topics, because the more you talk about, brainstorm, think about these kinds of issues as you're moving along, then you're ready for them when they're raised in the meetings you're going to be in. So, have these conversations, enjoy them. I love having these kind of sort of intellectual discussions of how this works. So go to it.
Thank you.
No problem. Are there other topics or issues? It sounds like there's some voting work going on. Are there any sort of other sort of high topic issues that you guys are really trying to address? I'd be interested to hear what your topics you're working on for your research.
Hi, I don't mind speaking up if anybody else wants to go. I didn't raise my hand. Is anybody else available? Any others? How much time do we have, Linda? Do we have a little bit of time?
21 minutes.
Oh, well,
We do, but to give everybody else a chance to just make yours, reasonable.
well, if anybody else wants to go ahead of me, go ahead, because I have spoken numerous times. If anybody wants to, they can. Any takers? Okay, well, my project is on the crisis of affordable, accessible, inclusive housing in our state. Our state has a very poor history with our Housing Finance Authority. There is a lot of data and documentation of lack of resources, lack of our state applying for federal grants and resources to support housing. Of the 1,200 units that our Housing Authority financed in 2022 with new project-based real estate development for affordable housing, less than 4% of those 1,200 units were accessible or developed. So this is a crisis, that's of a huge, huge, huge scale. And we all know what the terminology priced out means. So my project is based on, not building housing for people with disabilities. I'm a huge advocate against any type of non-inclusive and rural type housing. I know there's a need for that, but not in my world. So I've approached some senators, I've had some conversations, and I'm getting the ball going. I have some strategic partners, but I was just curious if you had been working on any issues related to the lack of HUD involvement and the lack of awareness towards this issue.
We've been doing a lot on this topic, and one of the things I would strongly suggest in your work here, and one very positive thing, we have spent a lot of time in DC doing a lot of coalition work. We are coalition kings at some level. But what we have done over the years is we have a number of coalitions that we belong to that are very disability specific. The Mental Health Liaison Group, they just changed their name, so let's see if I can get it right. Consortium for Constituents with Disabilities, there we go. But we have also affirmatively reached out to things like the Low Income Housing Coalition and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Juvenile Justice Network. And what we spend a lot of our first beginning time doing is, and I was ecstatic when I heard you say this, I can't tell you how many times I've seen letters from the Low Income Housing Coalition over the years. It was like, we need affordable housing. I said, well, yeah, that's nice. We all need affordable housing. But if it's not also accessible, it may be affordable for a person with a disability. They may not be able to actually get into it and live in it. So we've spent a lot of time training them about accessibility, and the importance of it, like how and all those kinds of things. And they've really accepted it and taken it into sort of their mantra, so that we don't have to say when we see a letter now, oh, can you add accessible? They sort of just do that directly. And so I would strongly suggest, finding those like housing coalitions that aren't disability specific, but may have a lot of power and a lot of sway in certain aspects of your state, and really getting them to understand the disability components and universal design and those kinds of things. We've been having some conversations with HUD now that we have an administration that actually will talk to people.
Yeah.
You know, to sort of raise disability and the stuff that our members are seeing in all the different areas. And we're really trying to get them to think about housing discrimination, not just in one silo, but add the disability silo and think of the intersectionality. So we're working on it a lot. We've gotten some good bills introduced that have some good disability components of them, and a focus on disability that probably a couple of years ago wouldn't have been there. But I think if thinking about what you're talking about, I would definitely try to bring your whatever state low-income housing coalition people,
Right.
housing groups up to speed.
Well, I would like to share with you, I will at one time, real quick, I have a very deep dive strategic proposal with a very strong national group that is behind us. And now it's just decided to come into Alabama behind my coalition to help us. So I will send you that. I'd love your thoughts on that and see what you
Great.
think. You might recognize the strategic part of it. I really appreciate the fact that you guys are you're a good resource. I'm just trying to get gather as many resources as I can.
Well,
Thank
I
you.
will definitely, I will share that with Claire, and if Claire's got ideas and thoughts, and we will definitely pass those along to you and see where we can help with that.
Thank you.
No problem. I know Eric's working on voting. Anyone else want to talk about their proposals and what they're working on? Or are you all like, it's almost 6, we want to go? Yeah, he's carrying them along.
Hey, Eric.
Yeah.
I'll go next.
Hey, Joe.
I'm Joanne Mulan, and my daughter Ashley's on the call as well. So we're working on actually improved direct supports. We've had issues with having really good quality personal care attendants for her and finding them and keeping them. So we're working on improving that.
That is.
She's in college at Auburn. And
James is rolling
just
his eyes.
being
I
able
can
to
tell.
find and keep good ones. Yeah, just being able to like keep them and find them and keep them. I mean, we'll find them and then they may only last. We've even had some like saying they would start and then they would quit after the first week just because they didn't want to have to do the lifting, the transferring in and out of the wheelchair and those types of.
What I would say in your example, clearly the other side is going to come up with a cost. That's going to be by far the biggest. But I think you've got a very strong personal story there, and the benefits of having personal care assistant. Your daughter's in college, the importance of it, the importance of consistency, and having one person that knows your daughter, her needs, those kinds of things, that not having to go through a personal care assistant, 52 of them, one every week over the course of a year. She may be a great self-advocate on that. And you as the parent, I'm going to say this, and this can be tough to hear a little bit. How far deep into the story I go? Well, I'm going to go a little bit and then I'll get to the point. We had a member of Congress a couple of years ago that was not happy with our mental illness program and tried to really slash it and cut it and get rid of it. And one year we were able to get an individual with lived experience come to testify in front of the United States Congress. Oh, I still got to find her testimony on video. And if I find it on the video, I'll send it around to James and to share. And she testified and she did an absolutely wonderful job and was great and was a perfect person. Was treated like, and excuse my language here, treated by absolute crap by the member that didn't like our program. There were 4 people on the panel. This is the one that stood out to me. She was the one in the farthest, well, technically from his viewpoint, Right. So he asked a question. He started with the person on the far left, and then he went to the second, then he went to the third, and didn't let Nancy answer. Basically just ignored her. And asked the question, had people read the legislation? And she would, the full legislation. And I know she had, because she asked me lots of questions on it. She raised her hand. He did not believe her. And basically was very derogatory. The next year, we had a parent come testify, treated much differently than Nancy had been treated. And it's hard for people with disabilities to hear this, but sometimes they will listen to what the parents say and they won't listen to what the individual says. So you sometimes have to balance and figure out the best way. You want to have both voices, but sometimes they might listen to you over but the member might listen more to the daughter than you. So play both of them. But you don't get frustrated. It's just the way people are. So, I think costs are definitely going to be one, but you really got to get them. And I would say this is both disability and aging is something that can happen. Well, aging will happen over time. Disability can happen at any point in your life. And then you may need this kind of assistance to continue to do the things you do. And do you want to have to struggle every single week finding someone new that may not know you, and you spend 3 days training them and getting them to know you, and then they're there for 4 days and then gone. So you can really personalize it and get them to think about how that is impacting them. But I would definitely, you and your daughter conveying these kinds of messages, I think would be very powerful on that topic. But there's work that needs to be done at the federal level to help with supporting home and community-based services, which will help fund personal care assistance and in a variety of other things. But yes.
Definitely. They're definitely not paid well enough. And I think that's part of the reason why they don't stick around very long, when they find out how much they have to do. And they're like, it's not worth it for the pay that they're getting and no benefits.
Or training. They're not even trained for what they're having to do.
Yeah.
I had somebody walk in, knock on my door one day, Eric, and she had not even been to the agency yet. They just kind of hired her, told her to come to my house. And I was supposed to leave and go to work. And she was kind of telling me that and talking to me. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not leaving this house for anything.
Eric, can
Betty's got her. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I thought I had my hand raised. Go ahead.
Betty does.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, another issue that's not mentioned there is, and I say this because I took care of my dad for 4 years and we had a helper, and it took two of us, and sometimes me and another sister and the caregiver just to live. So a question is, how do you go about getting someone that's able to do the lifting? Even if you look at putting the money aside and, you've got a worker. And I know one of my caregivers that I have for my son, and he doesn't need lifting or that kind of thing. But one of my caregivers did work for many years in a group home. He's older now, and he has severe back issues from that. So that's something else. What can be done about that?
You raised a very good point that one of the counters to the cost issue, and then I'll try to answer your question. I'm still trying to process it a little bit. One of the answers to the cost issue, and there's a lot of data out there, is the lost wages, the lost income, the lost everything else, which can be sort of which could be revenue to pay for better wages, better training, benefits, those kinds of things, because everyone, if you're spending, if you're having to not be at work and you're taking sick days and you're taking those kinds of things and because if you're taking care of somebody or those kinds of, there's lots of studies out there on that, which can be the counter to the cost issue of, well, if we increase the wages of this person, it's going to cost us X, which is, well, you're allowing the person with a disability, you're allowing the family member that is having to spend all the time taking care of to do other things. And, there is a quantitative aspect to that. So you can use that as a bit of a counter. I think hopefully to get to your point, I'm still struggling a little bit on making sure I was understanding that completely correctly.
Well, it's
It-
like
Mhm.
I actually retired to take care of him
Mhm.
because it was killing me I was the weekend person and my other two sisters shared during the week. And there was just and so then we got to the point where, and that was before we actually needed help to lift. But when we got to that point, we even had a CNA that we hired to help us. And we had, and he was not a large person, about your size. But two women, it's not exactly easy to pick someone up. And I'm thinking about, and I don't mean anything against Joanne's daughter about size, she's going to be even smaller. But had it not been for the CNA who did know some tricks, just turning and getting them to the bathroom and that kind of thing, so I'm thinking in and out of a wheelchair, those issues, how do you deal with that? Because I had not thought about that until it hit us, about, how do you do that on a daily basis? And I'm thinking about the caregivers that I know. Usually they're young people. They can be the older people because the ones I have now are older, but there's no way the people that I have now that are older that are helping my son could actually do any of the lifting like with my dad. So, even young people, how do we get caregivers that are able to lift without hurting them too? And I don't mean that in any ugly way. I'm being realistic.
Mhm. Not knowing, well, I think the answer that's hitting me right now is that some level of required training, but I'm not really sure who does the normal training for these assistants. So I'm not really sure where to go to figure out how to do this. Who should be, I'm not going to say required, but who should be the one doing the training?
Yeah, because I don't think you could just get someone like some of us have in the past, word of mouth, basically somebody that they know that's looking for a job. I think you need someone, and
Mhm.
even like for Joanne's daughter, for her daughter's safety, someone that knows how to do that.
Well,
And-
we went.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Eric. Go ahead.
I mean, what I was going to say is the thought that came to my mind is sort of thinking what I said on subminimum wage earlier. This is where you finding that personal care assistant that has had good training, that has had, has a good employer, and those kinds of things to sort of say, to be one of the faces of your discussion here of here, this is what the parent says, this is what the individual with the disability says, here's what the provider that has been here and willing to do it is saying, which is, I had all this training, I'm able to do these kinds of things, I get supported at my job, it's a good paying job, I've got benefits. And this provides me the wherewithal and the ability to stay in one place so that Ashley doesn't have to have a new personal care assistant every other week. So I would also look into trying to find that kind of good example on the provider side to be a spokesperson with you.
Okay.
Well, thank
And then-
you.
No,
Eric.
no
So-
problem. And I would also, and I think this is a good thing too, and with James talking about AARP as an important partner on this, is this is one of those here in DC, probably about 10-ish years ago now. The disability and the aging communities came together in a disability and aging collaborative. We sort of each had our own little set of coalitions, but didn't really cross much. And so we've really spent the last number of years sort of forging that partnership of the disability and the aging communities. Don't always agree. I'm not going to say that every single time you're going to get an agreement, but there really is a lot of overlap. And again, you can sometimes get the attention of members because they know the aging side. They may not know the disability side, but the aging person comes in and says to the member or the staff, these are good eggs. These are good people. Listen to what they're saying. And you've got your in there. And so doing that can be very helpful. So, I think, as James said, the AARP has been very good on this, and creating that kind of disability aging collaboration in, between groups in Alabama can be very helpful.
Yeah, I like what Veronica put in the chat. Family bathrooms being mandatory in all public spaces would be a first, even to put Hoyer lifts in. And I agree with that.
Yeah, I've seen a couple public places where I've been in that have had like not just the baby changing, but like the adult tables. And I'm sort of like, how the heck are you supposed to get someone up on that? I don't.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful.
Just trying to read the chat. Well,
A lot of
Veronica,
information coming in there. Yeah.
yeah, there is. No, this is a good discussion. No, I mean, you guys sounds like you're doing some amazing projects. Look, my clock's to 7:01 and I've kept you a minute long. I am sorry. I am a bad speaker. But I'll be back tomorrow. Enjoy your conversation with, you have Adderhalts, and I always thought it was Tuberville. How do you pronounce it?
Yeah,
Tuberville.
It is
yeah, we
Tuberville.
have representative from Tuberville and then Representative Adderholt in here tomorrow, right, Linda?
Well, the Tuberville is just a recording, but she did record it just to us on
Okay.
her phone. It's adorable. I mean, those generations are just different. So she recorded something for us, and then from Adderholt's office, we'll be in person. So, and Eric, we've been so fortunate. We have had a representative. These are the two federals, but we've had a state at every of our other events, our sessions.
That's great. No, that's wonderful. And definitely, again, while you're getting a video, take down the woman's name. And seriously, my guess is it's very possible, because Alabama is not that far away from DC. It's very possible over Memorial Day. It's very possible over the 4th of July. It's probably definite that in August, she will be there in Alabama. Ask for a meeting. And just, be able to talk about the issues you care about, things that are going on at the federal level, and really where people need help. And you don't need necessarily point to direct federal legislation. A lot of times staff are looking for ideas and things that need to be addressed in their state, senator level, district, representative level. And if you give them and they get very interested in that, they will find the people that know what needs to be done legislatively to address it. But you want to get them interested in the topic. So you can do legislation, but you can also just get them interested in, for example, you could talk to them about, personal care assistants. Just be very broad. You don't need a specific bill with it. They will then track down either bills that already are there or people that know what needs to be done legislatively and go from there. So be broad. But yeah, I would take her name. Once you get her name, we can easily get you an email address for her.
Well, no, she's been emailing back and forth with
Okay,
our DD
that's
director.
great.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, invite her for a meeting. Let her talk to you. Let her firsthand know sort of what's going on, and make that connection with all of you. That would be my suggestion. And now I've gone 4 minutes over, and people are going to be very angry.
Well, thank you again, Eric, and we'll see you tomorrow.